Hello and welcome to Big Pitch PowerPoint Slide Strategies. I am Marcus Weekly, the Director of the Center for Writing and Rhetoric. Thank you for joining me. Today we're going to have, a relatively straightforward session since we're just talking about this one narrow element of the presentation. We're going to look at understanding how to adapt to the context, using the slide to adapt to the specific general audience 3-minute format of the big pitch, some strategies for interacting with the slide if you choose to or not, and then a couple of design strategies as well. So if there is, a truism here with how to approach this slide, it's that less is more. And you'll hear that for the most part with general PowerPoint slide design strategies. You're going to want to speak a lot more than you put on to the slides, just generally speaking, right? You want the slides to complement what you're saying. If you're going to use the slides as, kind of a reference document, that's a different thing. It's a separate kind of presentation. But for the most part, the rule is, to minimize the text on a slide and to have it be complementary of what you're saying. So that is true here as well with the 3-minute thesis format that we're utilizing for the big pitch, but even more so. So if less was more before, it's even more. Less is even more here. You've got a really short amount of time, and you don't want the audience's attention to be taken away from you and what you're saying in that really short space of time, unless you're making a conscious decision to do that, right? Unless you are directing your audience to your slide explicitly for some reason. The text and any kind of complicated graphic on a slide for this presentation can distract your audience even more. And depending on how you're going to integrate the slide into your pre-recorded, this pre-recorded version of the big pitch, that might or might not be the case, right? You have the option of integrating the slide, editing it into your recorded video. You can do this in a number of different ways. You can have it kind of on the side of the picture the entire time. And we'll look at a few examples today from the University of Queensland where it looks like the finalists were probably recorded in a studio there. So they've got a very professional look to them. And that makes sense because the University of Queensland is, the main center for 3-minute thesis around the world. So a lot of, all the 180 plus universities that do a 3-minute thesis are looking kind of to them for the example. So it makes sense that they would do that, but we of course don't require that, nor are we able, unfortunately, to provide that at this point with the state of restrictions and things like that. But so, if you can have a slide next to you in the image, kind of like what I'm attempting to hold up here, you'll see a better example. Or you can edit it in to appear at a certain point as if you're referencing it, as if you're giving your pitch to a live audience and then you draw your audience's attention to it. You can do that on the pre-recorded video by having, the feed of the video feed of you speaking, shift over to the slide for a period of time and then shift back to you. And you can do that more than once. Those are all within the rules. Or you can not present the slide at all. You can have a title slide at the beginning as well if you want, or not. You can edit that in, or you can just submit it separately. The slides will be posted on the website for the preliminary round for anyone to look at while they watch the videos, and the judges will of course have access to them, right? So the judges will be able to, look at your slide while you're presenting. You don't have to necessarily have it as part of the video. So, in this case, it's not the same level of possible distraction as it would be for, a completely live audience presentation. At that case, the slide, when projected behind you, can compete a lot more. In this case, you have more control over how you want, when your audience sees the slide, how much. And so, there's not as much room there, but you still want to kind of adhere to these general strategies. Really, the takeaway here is that you want to utilize the limitation or the restriction of the single slide and the 3 minutes, if possible, to your advantage by coming up with a creative way to convey your message using the slide, right? I gave an example of a video that's on the Canvas site. Last week, I did a presentation at the Humanities Forum for humanities students, and I showed, a pitch of a researcher talking about whiteness, right? The concept of whiteness and what it's like to live in a culture within the dominant culture of a society, and how there are things that you don't see, that you take for granted because it blends in with your mindset, your worldview, let's say, your cultural view of life. So the slide was blank, and this was to convey, to really drive home her main point, right? And she referred to the slide and had the audience imagine things on it, and it was really powerful. It's a good example of taking the limitations of the presentation and using it to a creative advantage. Would I recommend doing this otherwise? No, I wouldn't recommend having a blank slide. In this case, it really worked having, and it wasn't just a blank slide, it was a white slide, right? So it worked really well to drive her point home. So I wouldn't necessarily, I'm not saying to copy that, but I'm saying to see if there are other creative ways that you can utilize this slide. But when it comes down to it, the two main things that you want to take away as like kind of fundamental rules are less is more. Okay, if you're unsure about what to do with your slide and it's getting closer to the deadline and you're still feeling like it's a weaker point of your presentation, then just keep it simple, direct, and don't try to do too much with it. Make sure it is less rather than anything more, and that will end up benefiting you. Otherwise, make sure that it complements your oration, what you're saying, definitely. But if you get a good idea that you feel like is creative, while still, just being complimentary and not overdoing it, it can be really powerful as well. So thinking of this in terms of two different core strategies, I think can also really help you in designing your slide. Think of it as either something you're going to explicitly refer your audience's attention to, or something that you're going to just ignore the entire time. You know that it's there, but there's no explicit reference to it over the course of your 3 minutes. So if you're going to do the latter, if you're going to take the ignore approach, then think of the slide as your backdrop. Even though it's not technically going to be your backdrop in our virtual format, you still want to think of it in that way. You want it to be an easily accessible, clear, straightforward image that speaks for itself. We'll see a few examples of this later on in the webinar. You want it to be some sort of representative image, something that's there to complement what you're saying, but it almost blends in, right? It blends into the points you're making, and your audience is just taking it as a visual representation of what you're talking about. So this is the winner of the University of Queensland's 2020 version of 3MT when they moved to the virtual format. So you'll see here, her slide is projected the entire time, not projected, her slide is there included in the feed, right? And it is just an image. It is an image of someone studying, they have coffee there, and they've fallen asleep. And as you'll see for once we go through this presentation, that is the key dilemma. That's the key context that she brings up in her talk. And so this is really an example of the backdrop version, right? This is a representative image. It's simple, it's accessible, it's straightforward. And once you start to hear what she's talking about, you'll see how it just really neatly maps on to her main points.
Imagine you're a student, it's late at night, and you have an exam the next morning. You want to keep studying, but you're exhausted. You have a decision to make. Do you stay up all night to cram, or do you admit defeat and go to bed? What would you choose? Often in this scenario, we might sacrifice sleep and reach for coffee or chocolate to power through. But what if there's an alternative? What if I told you the best thing you could do was swap that caffeine for a good night's sleep? Research shows that sleep can help us to consolidate new memories. In fact, sleep may play a critical role in transferring memories from short-term storage in our brain's hippocampus into more stable long-term storage within the neocortex. The problem is, not all new memories seem to rely on sleep. We're still in the dark about the role of sleep in learning new words. There is a need to identify methods to improve word learning, not only for students studying exam terminology, but also for the 1 million Australians living with a communication disorder. For some, it begins with a stroke. For others, it might be a lifelong disability. But regardless of the cause, difficulties with language can have a significant impact on a person's quality of life. So, to sleep or not to sleep after word learning? That is my PhD question. In phase 1 of my research, I recruited 75 healthy young adults who participated in 2 testing sessions. At the first session, the participants learnt an artificial language with nonsense words such as bleg or sports, so I could be sure the participants had never been exposed to the words before. The participants then returned 12 hours later to be retested on how well they remembered those new words. To answer my research question, I'd randomly assign half of the participants to a sleep group, where they went home to sleep overnight between the sessions, and the other half to a wake group, where they stayed awake during the day between the sessions. To account for testing the groups at different times of the day, I monitored participant levels of alertness, caffeine intake, and they also wore an activity monitor to measure their sleep duration. Although both groups demonstrated similar learning at their first session, when they came back 12 hours later, the group who slept remembered significantly more words than the group that stayed awake. So it's true, you should snooze or you lose. Now I'm conducting this same research with older adults to find out whether sleep can improve memory later in life. From there, my research has the potential to benefit people outside of the lab and may open up new ways to help populations with language difficulties simply by harnessing the power of sleep. So next time you need to learn something new, just sleep on it.
So I thought I'd let the example go all the way because you are going to be doing a pre-recorded presentation. So even though you probably got the idea early on about the strategy there for using the slide, I thought it was probably helpful to see a pre-recorded version go through. So it was a backdrop version that are if not really a backdrop version, then maybe an ignore version, and it was the sort of thing that, she sets up a scenario to start off as her hook at the beginning of the presentation to, grab her audience's attention. And that hook is represented there, right? The dilemma that really, sets up, the key question, some of the benefits of the outcomes of her research are there represented in the image. So it's a really direct and simple way of thinking of how to use that single slide. The other type of strategy of referring to it, I say here, choose a 15 to 30 second section. I actually, now that I've seen even more examples of this going back, it's often even less of a time, right? But you do want to choose, specific markers, let's say, in your 3 minutes where you're going to draw your audience's attention to the slide. And even more so, if there is more than one thing on the slide, to a specific part of the slide. And you want to mention that specifically and directly. We'll see a few examples, but you want to mention that specific part of the slide, draw your audience's attention to it for a specific reason. And then if this were a live presentation, you would want to then try to bring your audience's attention back to you very explicitly. In this case, you have, kind of the editing ability. So let's say you are editing in your slide and then pulling it back out. You can kind of more forcefully direct your audience's attention to a specific or to your slide. You can't include any kind of highlighting element or like circle a part of your slide or animate it in any way. You just edit in your slide and then take it away. But you can kind of, force your audience's attention in that sense. Nonetheless, you really want to be intentional about your use of referencing your slide directly. You want to do it to create effect and to highlight a specific element for a specific reason. Two key reasons of why to do this, or how to use this, is to use a visual representation to explain a complex idea. So, in a few examples, you'll see like a process or some sort of system representation on a slide done in, a full form, but still, simplified down. And this is one way to explain a complex idea that you don't have the time to get fully into, done on a slide in a succinct way. You can also utilize images to summarize key project elements. And this might be, really any part of a project that you think can be summarized visually. Cutting to a slide or referencing a slide, while, let's say, you don't edit it in, but you know that your audience has it, or you've got the slide there the entire time, like in the example we just watched. Referencing a slide, in those last two cases will be a bit closer to the live audience type move. You can do it either to explain a complex idea, summarize key project elements, or, make a joke maybe as well. We'll see an example of that. Those sorts of things will create an effect and add a certain depth to your presentation. So let's take a look at another example here. This is a brief reference to a slide, and this slide has more of a process image set up. So I thought that this might be a helpful kind of counter example. We'll watch only the first maybe half of this up until that reference point. But you'll see a bit of a difference here, and then we'll look at another example with a bit more of a direct reference.
If there is one thing that we all are terrified of, is probably the thought of how you might die. Is it going to be a car crash? Perhaps an aggressive cancer? Or a deadly virus, maybe? But according to the World Health Organization, heart disease beats them all. Heart disease has been the #1 cause of death for the past 15 years. It kills an Aussie every 12 minutes. Hopefully not in the next 3 minutes. But if you are the unlucky one, it doesn't matter whether we are in a hospital, the chances that you would make it through is very slim. Now, people have been trying to find ways to treat heart disease for centuries without much success. But in my research, I have discovered something very unusual that can happen. And it has to do with how your heart beats. You see, our heart is made up of millions of cells like these that can contract and relax, causing the heart to beat. But have you ever wondered how exactly it contracts and relaxes? The key is calcium. When calcium enters the cells contract. And when calcium is removed, cells will relax. Now, if calcium is not removed in time, it will kill your cell. So what removes calcium so efficiently, keeping your heart alive and pumping? A protein called SERCA does this job for you. Now, majority of
So you saw two quick references there, right? The heart is self-explanatory. The molecular image, I think he was referencing it with calcium. And then the third, the protein. These are the three core elements of his presentation, right? And so he went with this sort of process mode, which, as you can see, is quite different from the one we just saw. And he used the effect of referring to it real briefly to illustrate what those two, the middle and then the far side images, what they are, because most of the audience won't know, right? But they're key elements of how he's talking about the heart and heart disease. And, you know, it's a visual expression of these kind of complex scientific phenomenon that he's explaining to a general audience. And he utilizes the image here to not only convey their relationship, but also to give, you know, a visual representation of what he's talking about that might come across a bit too complicated. So he's putting it there, you know, directly, and using his slide to help him in that way to explain, to visually represent these complex ideas. Here's another reference example, and I'm mentioning this one because I think it's unique. You'll see, and we'll just watch the first part of this, but this is a presenter from the humanities, and they ask their audience to imagine. Their hook is to, you know, ask their audience to visualize something, to pretend you're in this place, and the slide is an important part of that visualizing process. So again, I feel like this is another example of referring to the slide. It's not a look at the slide, but the way that she asks the audience to imagine that they're in a place and then the slide is that place is really a reference to the slide. And I think it works. I think it's a creative use of, you know, having only one slide to complement what she's saying.
Picture this. You are in a hall the size of a football field, filled with over 100 massive sandstone columns, each over 20 meters tall. You walk amongst the columns, dwarfed by their grandeur. The space is dark and cool. Your senses are heightened, and you realize that every surface is covered in a language you recognize but can't understand. This is the entry to the Temple of Karnak. Built in Egypt over 3,300 years ago, it is a feat of engineering.
So that is the only time that she mentions the slide directly. And the slide, as you saw, is similar but different to our first example. The first example was a graphic, right, designed by the student. Or no, a picture taken, sorry, not a graphic. The second one's a version of a graphic, a process graphic. The first one's just a picture. It looks like either the presenter or a friend of being in the situation that is her hook that clearly represents the problem she's trying to solve. In this case, this is a picture of the site that the research is about. And the hook in this presentation is like, imagine you're there. Let me take you there. I'm building my bridge to the audience by asking you to come into this place. I mean, sounds very much to me as if she's been there. If not, she can clearly imagine what it's like to be there. And she wants the audience to feel that too, because there's a certain sense of grandeur there, right? That implies significance to the work that she's doing. And her slide is an image of that site, of the place, right? And there's nothing else there. There's no text whatsoever. Just like in the last two images, there's no text either in either of those. So these are different uses of either graphics or images of different types with no text, complementary text to, to complement the presentation. And this case, I thought, again, was a good example of a creative use of referring to the slide. Another thing that can be really helpful that you can do with the slide is to personalize it in some sort of way. You can do this either comically or in some other emotional way, or just, come up with something that's creative, that represents the work you're doing, that, really makes it hard for the audience not to have that takeaway, right? Not to leave the presentation remembering this thing you came up with. In this example that I have shown before, it's a dengue detective, right? So she is doing work on developing a means of testing and confirming dengue in patients in a much shorter amount of time than existing research or existing methods, excuse me. And in order to describe to the audience how her testing mechanism works, she's come up with this character called the dengue detective. And it works in her case because, she's talking about complex topics and then lightening it a bit with this personalized touch that she has, her dengue detective. And so it works, the contrast works. If you try to be too funny for too long, for too much of the 3 minutes, it overtakes your message, and you feel like you either don't have a point to drive home or you're relying on comedy too much. But interjecting something like this can actually really add a new layer of engagement to your presentation. In this case, this is also, a use of some sort of symbol, metaphor, element to relay a lot of information quickly. Like you'll, with the use of the alliteration too, the dengue detective, it's easy to remember, it's catchy, and it's something that represents a key element of the research, the processes through which this testing mechanism works much faster than others. So we'll take a quick look at it here.
To survive. And I felt that nobody should die from something as trivial as a mosquito bite, right? And so I dedicated the next few years of my life to find a solution. What I've developed is a dengue sensor, which is able to detect the virus more accurately and in a much shorter time. Meet my dengue detective. It holds 3 basic components: light, antibodies, and a tapered optical fiber, which has not been used before. And all it needs from a patient is 1 tiny drop of blood. They try, and then they bite, suck.
So her dengue detective, we see a combination of a few different strategies in this slide. We've got a process here, a process type graphic that's developed, and then we have a picture of a mosquito, right? And there is text in this one. So we've got dengue detective, the title of her finder, but also of the talk, or at least it's a consolidated version of the topic of the talk. You don't necessarily have to, you shouldn't put your title on your slide. You can have a title slide, but on your actual presentation slide, you're going to want something closer to this, something that says, in this case, dengue detective. We've got 1, 2, 3 there to help kind of guide the audience to see the different parts. And since she does refer to it real briefly, the audience's attention will be drawn there. I think this slide is something that in a live presentation the audience would be drawn to look at anyhow. there isn't, though, too much going on. It's kind of right on the edge. Dengue detective, only 2 words, the few other words. Dengue virus detective. I think anything more than this would probably be too much. The picture of the mosquito, just enough. So this is kind of right on the edge of almost being too much, but still definitely working for the presentation. So this, there's something here that a lot of presentations that I've seen that have been really successful do a lot more explicitly, and that is utilizing a symbol or a metaphor to explain, to be a key narrative element of conveying the main ideas of your research in a way that, through use of like an analogy, example, or metaphor, symbol, really conveys a lot of information quickly. In this other example that you can take a look at, I think after, we've got a car, a race car, standing in for a heart transplant, and the various things that can go right or wrong, and the key deciding factor of either a heart transplant patient having a successful transplant or having the heart rejected. And the entire time it's the race car standing in for the heart transplant. And so this is I think a successful use of a symbol for conveying the main points of the research. So design strategies. Here are a few options, and we've seen various of these in some of these examples. Just want to kind of list these out a bit more explicitly. So you can have one image for the entire slide. We've seen that as an example of kind of a produced image of the scenario. In the first example, that was the problem working to be solved or to provide an answer to, or an image of the site, right, of research or of the main thing you're talking about. You can design a graphic, or maybe combine a few images, right? So we saw that with the dengue detective or with the process kind of graphic of the earlier one on heart disease. You can centralize, and this is more of a process idea. Think of it in terms of like, okay, so I'm going to centralize one image, and this is my main point. And then if I'm going to include anything else, it's going to kind of be around this image. So where should I place this image so that the audience's eye is drawn to it and nothing else? There's really no other option for them to go elsewhere. So how design-wise do I prioritize that central image? And then working around it, what are the other essential elements that I want to include without doing too much? And then how do I set it up so that the audience's eye kind of moves in the way that I want it to? So one way to think about that is grid out your slide. I think either in like 4 parts, maybe 6 at most. Think of the slide as a grid, either 2, 4, maybe 6 at most. You could probably even do 3 different parts. And then, think of your audience's attention as moving from one part to the next. How are you going to guide it while still keeping it direct and simple? How are you going to ensure that the audience's eye moves in the way that you want it to, but you approach the design process by, breaking up the slide into a few different grids. Some other ideas, an image plus words, a close-up on an image. As we saw, develop a graphic that's either process, stages, or steps, or some sort of picture of you in action or the site of your work. All of these I've seen great examples of. Also seen like really developed kind of like graphic images that are almost like logo-esque in a way, the same sort of way you might approach a marketing logo of some sort, where the closest might be the image of the student sleeping and having the coffee there. You could imagine some sort of phrase and that be an ad for something almost like that. I mean, that was obviously a picture, but I've seen design logos there, and there are examples of that on the Canvas page. So here's an example from the 3-minute thesis team at the University of Queensland. And again, I don't know if I need to show it, but I wanted it here as a reference where they kind of show this, you know, this graphic here as a good idea, and then below it is a really busy slide with a lot of these different elements that we've talked about all put on it together. And the contrast is obviously the top one is better. So it's an example of the less is more kind of motto here. And here's another good combined example, I think, and I've showed this one before, so I won't do it too much. On, you know, the one side, you've got a image of clean water and fresh water, and the talk is about removing pollutants from water, cleaning water in a certain area. So you've got a visual representation of that, really strikingly so. And then you've got Nemo, which is a comedic kind of element that he refers to a few times in the talk. A few different Nemos, right? And he does an explicit reference both to the pollution and to Nemo in the talk. He points the audience there. And Nemo's not happy and then happy. We've got, you know, the process of the breakdown of the pollutants using sunlight there on one of the other grid areas. And then we've got an 80% reduction with a visual representation of the pollution being reduced, right? So you can see here that the slide was conceived of as a grid. We've got layering elements here of using a few different layers of images to visually represent the point while also connecting to a comedic element in the talk. We've got a complex chemical process that's represented not necessarily for you to be looked at closely, but just to show the audience, maybe to contrast a bit the fact that Nemo is on the slide, to bring back in kind of the seriousness or the technical nature of the research. And then of course the 80% reduction is an amazing outcome of the work, and so that's represented there visually. I think another good example, and actually combines a number of elements that we've talked about here as, you know, ways forward in designing this slide. So at this point, what I would love for you to do is just take a few moments. Take a few moments to think about, now that you've seen these different examples and heard a bit about these design approaches, you know, just a couple of minutes, just right fresh off hearing them. What approach or approaches do you think will work for your slide, given your topic? And now you're starting to mull over it more and think more about how you're going to approach this presentation. What approaches do you think will work? And what are you thinking about including? Obviously no pressure here, but this is kind of a generative thinking process. Like, start to work through maybe some possible things to include or a possible approach to take. So just for a few minutes, just go ahead and do like a quick write on this. Let's say just about 3 minutes here. All right, so please wrap up whatever thought you're having now. If you need to, leave a note for yourself. If you're having a good idea, you can jump back to it later. But like I always like to wrap up, please contact us if, you know, for any number of reasons, 3mt@cgu.edu or cgu.edu/thebigpitch. Matthew Higgins is our new Big Pitch communication specialist. He is available for one-on-one appointments. He's having drop-in hours on Thursdays and Fridays, and you can also schedule appointments with him. And you can meet with him as many times as you would like between now and, you know, the deadlines here for the big pitch. So please take advantage of both, the resource of the big pitch communications specialist, or reach out to me directly or through 3mt@cgu.edu.